You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and author of 3 baking books, including my latest, Snackable Bakes. Each Saturday, I'm hanging out with the sweetest bakers around and taking a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today's guest is Lauren Ko, the contemporary pie artist and author of the baking book, Pieometry. Lauren is also the culinary creative behind the popular Instagram account, Loko Kitchen. Since Pie Day is coming up, March 14th, we thought it would be fun to chat with Lauren about all things pie and her signature spoke design, which has been dubbed the modern lattice. The self-taught baker joins me to talk about her journey from novice baker to pie expert, and she guides me through her signature spoke recipe with berry filling. Stay tuned for our chat. Thank you to Plugra Premium European-style butter for supporting today's show. As some of you know, I've been a big fan of Plugra for some time now, and was introduced to it at my very first bakery job when I was just a newbie baker. Fast forward to today, I'm a professional baker, cookbook author, and recipe developer, and I continue to rely on Plugra for all my baking needs. My fridge is always stocked with Plugra sticks and solids. I especially love that Plugra contains 82% butter fat. The higher butter fat content means less moisture and more fat, and as bakers know, fat equals flavor. Plugra butter is also slow churned, making it more pliable and easy to work with. I do a lot of baking this time of year for work and for myself and my family. Comfy bakes like my pistachio chocolate anytime buns and cinnamon sugar buttermilk donut holes, and I always reach for Plugra unsalted butter. I've also been making a lot of yeasted breads lately, and I love the buttery flavor Plugra adds to my dough. Plugra Premium European-style butter is the perfect choice from professional kitchens to your home kitchen. Ask for Plugra at your favorite grocery store or visit Plugra.com for a store locator and recipes. Let's check in with today's guest. Lauren! So excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk about your signature spoke pie with bluebarb filling with you and so much more.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
You have a truly incredible pie-making origin story. Can you tell us about how and why you started making pies? And I believe that Pinterest may have played a role.
Yeah, it's kind of a long, winding story, but mostly it's all accidental. Basically, I moved to Seattle in late summer of 2016, and I was fun employed. My professional background at the time was in social work and nonprofit administration, so I was looking for a job in that space, and in the meantime, just kind of dinking around on the internet, as one does with too much time on their hands. And I think I stumbled across some really beautiful pictures of pie on Pinterest, and I thought, I've been cooking and baking my whole life, but in my Chinese, Honduran, American family, not a lot of traditional apple pie or really any pie happening. You know, I made it to adulthood having never made one and wondered if I could, so I just Googled a recipe. I don't even remember which one it was, where I found it, but basically I made my first plaid lattice apple pie, and it was fine. Didn't change my life. I didn't instantly transform into a pie lady. It was simply something that I kind of added to my repertoire of things that I would make for fun on the weekends or to feed my family. And that was that. I think maybe I made 3, 4 in the next year. So it wasn't even like an obsession or anything that I was wildly interested in. And then fast forward to August of 2017, when I started my Loko Kitchen Instagram account. And again, that was kind of also a fluke. It was just, I felt like I was becoming that friend and putting too many food photos in my personal Instagram account. And I feel like Instagram was a different space back then, so I really needed a little bit of separation. I really just meant for it to be a personal photo album, a holding space for things that I was making, again, for fun or to feed my family. It was going to be, summer salads, blueberry muffins, alfajores, or, whatever I was making. But it just so happened that the first photo I posted was this geometric peach pie. And again, that was probably like the 5th pie I'd ever made in my life. It was probably just the most recent photo in my camera roll. And then it got several hundred likes, which as a regular person by then, just working a normal office job, totally blew my mind. A few days later I was like, well, should I post another photo of a pie or a tart or something along these lines? So that's what I did. Again, several hundred likes. Within a month, I had 1,000 followers, which again, as a regular person was like, what is happening? Are these trolls? Are these bots? Should I go back on private? Like, I don't know who these people are. How are they finding me? Again, totally different landscape. That was also the time that I created and shared my first of what would become my signature spoke to celebrate that kind of 1,000 followers, and things just kind of snowballed and spiraled from there.
You were struck with textiles and colorful designs and geometric patterns, and those were the things that kind of excited you artistically. And so then you thought, well, why don't I put that on a pie?
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple factors coming into play at that time. I had an office job by then. I wasn't super happy. It wasn't very creative. And so, baking for fun post-workday or on the weekends was kind of my creative outlet, and also this therapeutic Zen session for me to zone out, think about something else, and kind of recharge. And I've also always just loved design. I've always been an appreciator of art and, color and texture, textiles, all kinds of things. And then also when I first stumbled across those beautiful pictures of pie on Pinterest, pie was slow, I think maybe coming into its moment. And there were a few original pie makers who had these really beautiful, floral pie tops, or it was really popular to do letter cutouts and have little messages on the pies, but just a lot of really rustic foliage, things like that as a novice, I felt like I could not create. I didn't feel confident in my dough making skills or my kind of freehand design cutting. And so I just naturally, one, gravitate towards kind of clean modern design, but two, for this particular instance, it was a lot of geometric designs are constructed of straight lines. That's kind of how I settled on this aesthetic, was just I can cut dough out of straight lines and then construct them that way. And that's kind of how I landed on this aesthetic that embodies Loko Kitchen now. And then just always drawn to color, always trying to do things that I don't see happening elsewhere, or trying to think outside the box or the circle and do things that, pie is this very traditional rustic dessert, and I didn't see anybody kind of exploring it in a modern, colorful way at that time. And so just wanted to explore something that I hadn't seen before.
Instagram ended up leading to a book deal and your New York Times bestselling book, Pieometry. Can you tell us about the book?
It is a book with 25 pie recipes and 25 tart recipes. And within those, there's crust recipes, there's dough recipes, there's filling recipes, and also step-by-step instructions for 50 designs. I like to say that this is a book for everyone. So whether you are a trained pastry chef, which, by the way, I am not. I've never worked in a professional kitchen, nor have I gone to culinary or pastry school. And so this book is also for people who are like me, home bakers who just enjoy creating at home in their own space. And it's also a book for armchair bakers, for people who like to appreciate good design, lots of color, lots of texture, and who like to eat with their eyes. And it's also a great gift. So if you don't like to bake, you can give this to someone and have them make these things for you.
Two other things I wanted to say about the book. You say that really, even though the pies look difficult to produce, they can be achieved with a knife, a ruler, and some patience. Have you found that to be true from people buying the book and writing to you, hopefully nicely, DMing you, etc., saying, yes, because I am such a awkward person I just feel like I would not be able to do it, that there's no way I could cut the strips as thinly as they needed to be cut or all of that kind. What would you say to someone like me?
I mean, as I tell everyone, if I can do this, anybody can. I understand that some of these things that I do, some of these designs do require a little bit of time and patience. And again, this was just kind of my zone out activity in the beginning. But I'm also a huge proponent of making what you have work for you. So if you're short on time, short on patience, there are designs and ways that you can craft something that looks and tastes beautiful within your parameters. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. When I started doing this, I didn't even have a ruler in my apartment, so I used a cookie sheet and a paring knife to cut those dough strips. And yeah, as I teach my workshops, I tell people at the beginning of class that most of my designs look more complicated than they are to execute. And everybody's always like, yeah, whatever, like, right. And then I do the demo, and the last half of class, everybody gets to make their own pie. And the signature spoke is one of those designs that I teach, and a majority of people construct that design, and they're always shocked by, one, how quickly it comes together, and two, how simple it really is to execute. It's been dubbed the modern lattice, and I think it's actually easier than the traditional lattice because there's no like folding back strips and figuring out which pattern. Once you put a dough strip on your pie, you're done with it. You move on to the next thing and you don't have to think about it again. So yeah, I think if maybe one design feels too complicated for you, then surely there's another one in the book. But yeah, I'm a huge proponent of this is easier than it looks, which is nice because you have something like really fancy and beautiful at the end, and you didn't necessarily have to like break your brain or do any high level calculations to get there. But also there's something for everyone.
Before we dive into your pie, tell us a little bit about what you're working on. I think you're maybe focusing on like in-person workshops and events.
Yeah, I'm currently teaching a bunch of workshops around Seattle, and then in March for Pie Day, which has become the biggest day of the year for me, surprisingly or not surprisingly. I get to go teach a couple workshops with the Dallas Arboretum. And then usually summer is a little bit slower, so I just kind of hang out and make plans for fall, which is big major pie season. So usually I have a lot of workshops and classes of different varieties and do lots of in-person events at that point. That's basically what I'm focused on. People keep asking if I'm writing another book. I'm not ready to jump back in quite yet.
We'll be right back. Today's episode is presented by California prunes, the best kind of prunes out there. I'm a big fan of California prunes for two reasons. They're a great addition to your pantry when it comes to smart snacking and baking. California prunes are good for your gut, your heart, and even your bones. They contain dietary fiber and other nutrients to support good gut health and vitamin K, copper, and antioxidants to support healthy bones. I've started making myself a daily smoothie, which is a great vehicle for incorporating healthy foods into your diet. One of my favorite combinations right now is blueberries and kale with some prunes added for natural sweetness and depth of flavor. When it comes to baking, you can use California prune puree to replace some of the sugar, eggs, or fat in a recipe. It's super easy to whip up. Just blend prunes and water together, and voila! You can also add California prunes to any treat that calls for dried fruit, like bread, scones, cakes, and cookies. Prunes pair well with ingredients like chocolate, caramel, honey, coffee, even chilies. They also add sweetness and depth to savory recipes like chicken marbella, sauces, or stews. For recipe ideas and more, be sure to check out the California Prunes website at californiaprunes.org. Happy baking and happy snacking. I've got great news, listeners. Jubilee 2024 is taking place Saturday, April 20th at Center 415 in Manhattan, and tickets are on sale now. Jubilee is the largest gathering of women and culinary creatives in the food and drink space in the U.S. It's a beautiful day of conversation and connection, and I hope to see you there. You can learn more and snag tickets at cherrybomb.com. Now back to our guest. So now we're going to talk about your signature spoke pie with bluebarb filling. Your signature spoke design is rightly considered the modern lattice and is a mainstay of the book. I think I've read its design to you represents your name, your brand, and an entire modern pie movement. And I think that the design is based on string art. Can you tell us what string art is?
Either string art or kind of like a mix of those spirograph stencils that I really loved as a kid. String art, I think it's that kind of art medium where people put nails into a wooden board or some sort of harder surface, and then they basically construct a full design wrapping string in lines or concentric. I'm terrible at math, so I don't even know what the correct vocabulary is, but basically you wrap string around these nails and create these designs. And it was also inspired by a lot of those spirograph stencils that I was really obsessed with as a kid, which, funny story, I was recently in a drugstore, like a CVS, getting passport photos done, and they had a pack of spirograph stencils for sale, and I had no idea that was still a thing these days. So, well, I don't know if, having them in CVS means they're relevant, but I was shocked to see them on the market all the same. But basically, there are these designs or geometric shapes constructed of straight lines. And that was the inspiration for this spoke design. And again, going back to being a novice, I didn't think that I could do any sort of crazy designs or anything that was hand cut. But I was confident in my ability to cut dough strips. And that's kind of how this design was born.
So first things first, we're going to make 2 discs of pie dough for this particular pie. We're going to combine some ice and some water in a small cup. Then we're going to combine in a large bowl some flour, sugar, and kosher salt. Do you like a glass bowl or a metal bowl? Do you have a go-to?
Yeah, I have a whole stash of large stainless steel mixing bowls that I use for my workshops. And so I just kind of keep those in my kitchen and reach for those too. They're nice because they're dishwasher friendly, so I can just toss them in afterwards.
Restaurant supply kind of situation with those?
Pretty much.
Yep. So we have our dry ingredients in this big bowl. We're going to stir up the dry ingredients. You say just stir with a spatula. Should I be picturing like a flexible silicone spatula or a wooden spatula? What's your tool of choice?
I love a silicone spatula that's kind of sturdy but still has a little bit of flexibility on the end to kind of scrape up at the end.
Now we're going to add some cubed unsalted butter. You're going to toss the cubes to coat them in flour. I assume you can do that with the spatula or your hands.
Yep.
Then you're going to flatten each cube of butter with your pointer fingers and your thumbs. I love the specificity of which, often people say just with your fingers, but I love the specificity of the pointer and the thumb. And then toss to coat flattened butter pieces. And now we're going to continue to massage that butter into the dry ingredients. At this point, still using either the spatula or your fingers?
Yeah, usually my hands. I like to get in there. That way you can kind of control the butter piece sizes. I think a lot of recipes when I was first learning to make dough say an assortment of walnut-sized pieces or peas, but I prefer an assortment of cornflake sizes because I want those butter pieces to be flat to bake into those pastry layers instead of round chunks.
Well, my next note was going to be how much I love the cornflake comparison, because I've never heard it described that way, and I feel like that's, at least for me, having eaten cornflakes as a child, that's very visceral, and I'm like, oh yeah, cornflake, of course. That makes so much more sense. When you think walnut or pea, you're thinking round and thick, but you're kind of forsaging it, as it were. So we have a range of cornflake-sized pieces that we've massaged, and you can do up to this point in the recipe in a food processor as well, which is just, you're still combining that water and ice, but then you're putting the dry ingredients into a food processor, pulsing quickly to incorporate, sprinkling in the butter cubes, pulsing about 20 to 25 times. Again, at this point, are we looking for cornflakes when we open up the food processor? I know there might be some errant pieces that didn't quite get cornflakey enough, but is that still our visual with the food processor?
Less so. I think with the food processor, it's harder to get those flakes. And so I generally make my dough by hand because you have better control of the butter pieces. But doing it in the food processor does save a little bit of manual labor and time. Usually if I go that route, I'll just take a quick peek and sift through some of the butter really quickly and just flatten any pieces that look a little too round, a little too large.
If you're to use the food processor, you're going to have dumped into that big, large bowl that you used if you made the dough by hand. You're going to add 2 tablespoons of that cold water, and then you're going to sort of fluff the moisture through the flour with that spatula, kind of gently turning the mixture, as it were, to moisten the dry ingredients and the butter. And then you're going to continue adding cold water, 1 tablespoon at a time. Is there a typical amount of water that you think you end up using from that ice and water mixture, or is it just so weather dependent and temp of kitchen dependent that it just changes all the time?
Yeah, it really depends. I think it depends on, the flour, the butter that you're using, and to some extent the weather. In my book, I have the recipe for a single disc of dough, and I basically always make 2 discs at the same time, so I double the recipe. For double, it's usually anywhere from 8 tablespoons to 11 on a really juicy day. So I know that pie dough has that reputation for being really scary and finicky, and so much of what I've learned is just by repetition and practice and doing over and over until you get a sense of how it should feel, how it should look.
I think it's scary for people, and I'm one of the people who's scared because I love being told what to do. And I find it
Same.
very hard when I have to make decisions in the middle. Like, what do you mean I should just keep going? I don't know. I want someone to say, stop at this, But you're right.
Totally.
It's about feel and it's about look and it's about practice.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I also want to know that it's going to, like, as a perfectionist, I want it to turn out that first time. I want it to be good every time. But as I've learned, so much of what I've really learned about like baking and pie dough and pies is from quote unquote failures or mistakes. That's what has taught me the most. So when people in my class are like, oh, I'm scared, like, what do I do next? Or like, I'm just really hesitant to jump in there, I like to tell them that there are no baking failures, just learning experiences. So even if you're scared, go for it. And if it doesn't turn out exactly as you hope, you'll still have takeaways to guide you on your next baking venture.
Yes. So as you're incorporating this water into the butter, into the dry ingredients, you're kind of pressing the dough with your flexible spatula after each tablespoon until the dough begins to come together, but you're going to avoid heavy kneading. And by heavy kneading, do you just mean you're going to avoid trying to kind of turn it into a cohesive dough in that bowl with the pressing of that spatula?
Yeah, definitely. I think dough is the same word used for bread and pie, and I think the process is very different. So we're not super handling it and mixing it and putting a lot of strength into this kind of dough, unlike bread. We're just bringing it together until it holds. We're not really getting in there with our knuckles or hands or any sort of muscle strength.
Now we're going to turn the dough out onto our work surface. Do we need to flour the work surface at this point? Or
I do not.
Okay, still pretty crumbly so that you don't have to worry about it sticking.
Yeah, usually if your dough is sticking, you probably put
in
a little bit too much moisture in there. Yes.
So we turn our dough out onto our work surface. We're going to gently form it into a rounded mound with our hands. We're going to wrap the dough tightly in plastic wrap and then gently press it into sort of a round, flat disc about 5 inches by 1 inch. And we're going to refrigerate for at least 3 hours. Why 3? I feel like often you see 1 or even 2, but 3 seemed long to me. Is that just your experience for when the dough is going to be the most easy to work with if you wait that amount of time?
Yeah, I prefer a dough that's a little bit more formed and relaxed. I think you can certainly roll out pie dough and make a delicious pie in less time, but for a lot of my designs that require a little bit more durability, a little bit more time, it'll just be much easier the longer you let your dough rest. So I basically always let my dough rest overnight. I think 3 hours is the bare minimum, but I rarely ever kind of reach for a dough that's been sitting that short. I usually make a huge batch of dough the day before, let it rest overnight, and then I'll make the pies the day after, or I'll toss all that dough in the freezer so that when I am ready to make it, I can pull out dough and let it thaw and have it ready to go.
Speaking of that, if you're letting a dough disc that you have frozen thaw, are you doing it in the refrigerator or on the counter, and how much time does it need?
I usually do it overnight in the refrigerator if I have the wherewithal to think ahead and plan ahead. If I'm in a rush, I'll let it sit on the counter until it's thawed, and then I'll pop it back in the fridge for at least an hour before I really roll it out.
So now we're going to roll out the pie dough. First question, do you have a particular kind of rolling pin that you like a one with handles, one that's tapered?
The one that I have is a tapered one, and that's simply because that was the one that was in my kitchen way back when, and it's just what I've become accustomed to. So in my workshop, I talk a lot about, make what you have work for you. So if you have a rolling pin with the movable handles, or you have a dowel-shaped one, any of those will work for any of these designs. It's just whatever you're most comfortable with is what's going to be the best one for you.
So we're going to roll one of our discs into an 11 by 15 inch rectangle. We're going to roll the dough onto the rolling pin and then unfurl it onto a sheet of parchment paper. Question for you, would you ever roll it out on the paper?
I don't like to, because I find that it slips around and it's a little bit unwieldy, and so it's much easier and more straightforward for me to just roll it out on my countertop and then move it to a parchment sheet.
And again, we don't need to flour the countertop with your dough, correct?
Before I roll out the dough, I do put a little bit of flour.
So at this point, we would
I'll flour the work surface. I'll probably dust a little bit of flour on my rolling pin, and then I'm constantly moving the dough as I'm rolling to make sure that it's not sticking to the countertop. And if it is, I'll sprinkle a tiny bit of flour on. You can always dust off excess after.
We've unfurled the dough onto a sheet of parchment paper, and then we're going to use a ruler. What kind of ruler should I picture? Like a thin metal one?
Yeah, I like stainless steel because, again, I can toss that into the dishwasher afterwards. Okay. I came into a whole supply of like wooden ones for my workshop, so that's what I use. Those are a little trickier to when you wash. You have to make sure they're like super dry before you put them away, but pretty much anything will work. I find that any rulers that are like super heavy, they can be a little bit more unwieldy, but pretty much we're just using the ruler as a straight edge. And in the book and the recipes, I have to provide specific measurements, but rarely am I measuring the width of my strips. People think I'm like going one by one and like making sure I'm eyeballing it. And the most important thing is just to make sure you're holding your ruler secure so it doesn't wiggle around, and then you get those straight lines. Otherwise, it's approximate. You don't need to stand there and mark out each little strip.
If we all want to buy rulers, is it something you buy in like a restaurant supply store, or is it just a ruler you get at Staples?
I think the Staples ones are fine as long as the stainless steel ones don't have that cork backing on. I think that gets kind of gross after you wash it a while, and it just like absorbs. It doesn't feel very sanitary. So stainless steel, I like the ones that are a little bit longer, like 15-inch, 16-inch, so they give you lots of leeway for those continuous lines. But yeah, either a restaurant store or just office supply store is fine.
So we're using the ruler, as you said, as a straight edge, and then we're also using a rolling pastry wheel. Again, I assume it's not a fluted wheel, so almost like a pizza cutter situation you could use?
Basically, the one I use has the like crimped wheel on the other side and then just a straight blade on the other side. I've never used the fluted side because I always go with the straight lines, but a pizza cutter would be fine. A sharp paring knife would also work.
So now we're going to cut the rectangle that we've rolled out width-wise. Mm-hmm. I always get confused. Width means we're going horizontally?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I mean, that's how my brain works. I'm like, what's a width?
I know. Same. Basically, you want to cut across the long edge, if that makes any sense.
Right, because it's 11 by 15 inches.
Shorter. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And the 11 inches are your sides, and the 15 inches are the ones, as they say, facing you.
Yes. So your strips should be 11 inches long.
Yeah. So we are going to cut the rectangle width-wise into 30 quarter-inch strips, but as you said, you're not there measuring. You're just trying to get about 30 strips, more or less.
Totally.
Is it really important that the dough is super cold at this point? Like, should we be moving between our refrigerator and our counter at this point for fear of the dough getting too soft?
Yeah, I think it depends on your environment and what the weather is like. When I make this in the summer, it gets a little bit trickier, and I do find that I spend more time putting the dough in the fridge, which is also why I roll the top disc of dough out first so that it can sit in the fridge while I do the rest of the steps. And so if it is getting soft, if you're trying to cut your dough into strips and the dough is sticking to your wheel, you can either flour it or stick it back in the fridge. The colder it is, the easier it will be to work with.
Once you've cut your strips, you're going to slide a flat baking sheet. So in other words, I almost never use them anymore, but I remember them from childhood more. It's a baking sheet that has no rims. Mm-hmm. Correct?
Correct.
And usually there's like one edge of it that's like a little bit raised,
like a little handle.
Is like how you hold it. Okay. So we're going to use that kind of baking sheet.
Yeah, and if you only have rimmed baking sheets, sometimes that's all I have to use. I'll flip it upside down and then put the dough on that side.
That's a great tip. That's a great tip.
It just makes it easier to slide the dough off the sheet later.
Right. So we're going to grab that parchment with the dough on top of it, slide the baking sheet underneath that piece of parchment, and then place that in the refrigerator. Now we're going to roll out our second dough into a 14-inch circle, roll the dough onto the rolling pin, and then unfurl it into a 9-inch pie pan. I read that you're a fan of metal pie plates.
Yes,
as
my
opposed to
favorite
glass.
one is the USA pan. I've basically never, ever gotten soggy bottoms with that pan. And also because I give away so much of what I make, I mostly use those disposable foil tins. The ones that are a little bit sturdier. So there are ones where you pick it up and your pie basically folds in half. I don't buy those, but the disposable ones they still bake really great, and I can give away all these things and not have to worry about getting all my pie plates back.
So now we're going to take the edges of this dough circle that we just rolled out, and we're going to gently ease the dough into the pan, nestling it in, and I love this so much, nestling it into the inner elbows of the pie pan. I love that image And I was literally, as I was reading that, I was like looking at my elbows, like, oh yeah, hello, hello, pie pan elbows. I love that. And we're going to trim the excess dough with kitchen shears. And we're going to create a 1-inch overhang and then fold the overhang back under itself to create a slightly elevated edge. But obviously we're not fluting or anything. So should I picture that extra edge being kind of on top of the rim of the pie plate, like resting on the rim?
Yes, it should definitely be resting on the rim. Anything that kind of hangs over will probably melt off or droop when you bake it. I teach both, so we either do the clean modern edge where we fold it under, or we leave extra overhang and then we do the crimped edge at the end.
It shouldn't stop within the pie plate. It needs to sort of come out and sit on the top so that we can stretch our strips across.
Correct. Otherwise, your pie, you run the risk of your pie also slumping down into the plate.
Right.
Yes.
So now we're going to make our bluebarb filling. This is one of the things I do love about pie making because often a filling is so simple, like this one, where we have some fresh or frozen blueberries. We're setting aside about a quarter cup of them. I also love that you can use fresh or frozen. I think that's nice for people because you can make this in any season. So then we're going to combine that with fresh or frozen rhubarb, some sugar, some tapioca starch. Can you tell us why that is your starch of choice?
Yeah, it's my thickener of choice because, one, it's super affordable and easy to buy. It's readily and widely available at Asian grocery stores where I shop a lot. And also, something that I learned from Stella Parks is that when it gels with the fruit juices, the gel is clear as compared to, a flour or a cornstarch filling where it tends to be a little bit cloudier. So just aesthetically, I think it looks a little bit more appetizing, and it also thickens with your fruit juices pretty reliably.
We're going to add some lime juice in there, some kosher salt, sugar. This is all in a large bowl, and then we're gently folding with a spatula until the fruit pieces are coated with that mixture, and then we're going to pour the filling into the pie shell. And now our moment of truth. We're going to create our spoke.
Yes.
So we're going to place a 2-inch circle cutter. I'm picturing like a cookie cutter or a biscuit cutter.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. And if you don't have one, you can also use a small bowl or a cup and put it upside down. Anything that's kind of round and that approximate size will work.
And we put that in the center of the pie. And we're using this as a reference point as we build our spokes around it. Now we're going to use a small pastry brush. And we're going to lightly dab water around the edge of the pie shell. So this is like our glue, obviously. The water is like our glue for the spokes. Is there a reason? I mean, I love that we're just using water, but is there a reason we're using water and not egg wash?
Because the design process can get a little complicated, if there are ways that I can simplify every other part of the process, I will. That's why I don't add any other liquids to my pie dough. I try to keep the fillings relatively simple and straightforward. I want to devote all my time and energy and brain space to the design part, so keeping it simple.
So now we remove our dough strips from the fridge. We're gently going to pick up a strip, handling it only from the ends. Why is that important to remember? If we hold it from the middle, will it break?
It probably won't break, but you might squish it a little. You'll kind of ruin that pristine line. And with dough, the golden rule is to keep everything cold. So the more you handle it, the more places you touch it, the more risk you run of warming up your dough, of getting it kind of melty and squishy. So the less you touch it, the better, and just handling it by the ends is enough.
So we hold it by the ends, and we're going to lay it across the pie with the strip grazing the outside of the circle cutter. So it doesn't really matter for this first piece where we place it, as long as a little bit of one of the sides of the strip touches our center cutter.
Correct.
Okay, great. Now we're going to lightly press the strip into the edges of the pie, which has a little bit of water on it, and that's going to secure our first strip.
Correct.
And now I will go take a nap because I'm so nervous. Only
no,
kidding.
And that's the entire technique.
Right, which is great.
You just repeat that until your pie surface is covered.
We take another dough strip. We lay that across the pie. This time, the center of the second strip should lay slightly on top of the first and also graze that center circle. But the big thing that I'm getting about where it gets placed is that the end of the strip that's in your left hand is 1/2 inch off of the first strip that's already down, and the one in your right hand is 1/2 inch to the right of the other strip.
Yes. So it
correct?
Sounds really technical, but yes, the end in your left hand is to the left of the previous strip. The end in your right hand is to the right. So basically, you're just moving the same direction all the way around the surface of the pie. It can get a little like fuzzy because it tends to be an optical illusion. So sometimes people put a couple strips down and they're like, oh no, what's next? You're just moving in the same direction all the way around, laying these straight strips all along the surface.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it very intellectually. I also think that once you're actually doing it, it makes sense. It's just when you're reading it, you're like, just a minute.
I mean, I don't learn by reading technical instructions, so even writing them was hard. 'Cause I'm like, oh, this feels and sounds so complicated, but it really isn't. You're just laying straight strips, left to the left and right to the right. Another tip I have about this design is that because it's sort of an optical illusion, sometimes I see that people have a tendency to want to curve these strips around that center cutter and make it like a spiral vortex, but it's just straight lines. So you don't have to think about curving it or wrapping these strips. You're just laying straight lines all the way around.
And we're going to continue laying the dough strips in this fashion, working our way around the pie surface twice. Explain to me twice. Is that because the second time around we're filling in that half-inch space between each strip?
Sort of. It doesn't always end up that precisely, but basically you just want a double layer all the way around, and that's just your visual cue for knowing that you're done. So sometimes they happen to fall nicely in between the previous strips, but if not, it's also not a deal breaker.
Okay, good. Now we're going to press the edges of the pie. Again, there's a little bit of water on that edge. Press the edges of the pie to secure the strips in place, and then holding a paring knife at a 45-degree angle to our work surface, we're just going to run around the edge of the pie pan to trim the excess dough. We're going to gently remove that center ring, the little biscuit cutter or the cookie cutter, and carefully fill that crater with the reserved blueberries, which I love that.
Purely aesthetic, but still fun.
Yeah. I was going to say, I wondered if when you first made it, did you not put anything in there? And then you're like, oh, this would be a cool spot to put something.
Yeah, it just felt like it was missing something. And sometimes I'll even put fresh blueberries after I bake it, just for a touch of freshness and just a little bit of a texture contrast.
So we fill with the reserved blueberries. Now we're going to chill the pie in the freezer, only just while the oven comes to temp to 425 degrees, maybe about 20 minutes, depending on your oven. Or you can freeze the pie till solid. But basically, we're just chilling it before baking.
Yes.
We're going to line a rimmed baking sheet with parchment. We're going to prepare an egg wash. And I kind of love this part. You give us a lot of choices about egg washes, like different kinds of egg wash, depending on the kind of finish we want. And I am working on a new cookbook and happen to have like an entire recipe page and photo devoted to egg wash. So I really appreciate this.
Yeah, there's so many options out there.
Yeah, it's really important. But I understand that you say like if your wash is just milk, then it's going to be a brown matte finish. If it's egg white, it's going to be a clear and shiny finish. Whole egg, yellow and shiny. And then whole egg with splash of heavy cream, deeply golden and shiny. And I love that you just give us all those options. Is that for any of the pies in the book, or for this specific pie, would you like us to be using a whole egg?
I basically only egg wash my pies when I'm using my plain all butter pie dough. So if there's no coloring involved, then I want to bring out that deep golden brown. If I'm using any of the other doughs that are naturally colored with fruit juices, vegetable powders, I want to maintain as much of that color as possible. So I do not egg wash those, and I'm a little bit more finicky as I'm baking. But for this particular pie and this dough, egg wash, we want it super golden and crusty and beautiful and delicious.
So the oven reaches temp, we remove the pie from the freezer, place it on the prepared sheet, and we're going to egg wash it with the whole egg and cream, I assume, and sprinkle with Demerara sugar. I love the sparkle and crunch that sugar brings to pie crust. Does it affect the design at all?
Not usually. I think as long as your pie is properly chilled, then that sugar doesn't really have an effect. I find that if your dough is like warm and a little bit melty and you sprinkle on that sugar, it does start to blend in together. And so it's just visually less crisp, but it will still taste delicious. So either way.
So now we're going to bake for about 25 minutes, rotate the pie 180 degrees, and lower the temp to 350. If our edges are already brown, we'll cover with a shield. Tell me what kind of shield you like. Do you like those I think I have like a bright red silicone one that kind of fits around the edge of I don't even know what brand it is, but that's the one I have.
Yeah, I also use those because they're reusable and I can, again, toss them in the dishwasher, but I kind of find them really annoying to use. They're a little fiddly, they don't stay that well, and they're hard to handle when they're really hot, but they're just the best option I've found that isn't using a new sheet of foil every single time.
Right. If the top begins to brown excessively, we do rest a sheet of foil lightly on top. I find, and this is probably because I have a convection oven, but I find my foil is always flying around. Does yours just kind of stay put, or do you have to bend it at all to get it to sort of like lay there?
Mine generally stays. The convection option doesn't work on my oven, so I never bake on convection. So I guess I don't really have to worry about the fan running. But if the foil is not stable, I'll just maybe press it a little bit in the center so that it has a little bit of structure. But we also don't want it to stick to the surface. So usually it stays.
Now we're going to continue baking until the filling is bubbling in the center, which is just like a pet peeve of mine. I feel like people don't understand that. First of all, pie needs to be brown. It's not supposed to be pale. Even though it's very pretty, when it's a pale golden, usually your fruit is not cooked and your pastry isn't even really cooked unless it looks very brown. And then also you actually have to see the fruit with bubbles in the center, not around the edges. Then you're done.
Exactly. Because when we're using these thickening agents like tapioca starch, we want that to cook out. Otherwise, we're going to get this gritty, floury taste and texture when we eat it. So it's really important that your filling cooks through. One of my biggest baking failures or disasters was underbaking a pie, underbaking the filling, and I have never done it since. So once you do it once, you cannot do it again because it's so gross and devastating.
And also, it's soupy. It's not, the filling isn't set. I feel like you can see that when, I don't know, somebody's doing a cooking video or something and it looks gorgeous, but you know that once that thing is sliced, it's just going to collapse.
Exactly. And that crispy, flaky crust that you worked so hard on, you lose all the value in that because the soup is just solidifying everything.
Totally. We're going to check our pie every 30 minutes, rotating the pie and adjusting the shields as necessary for 80 to 100 minutes, which I also love. Pie takes a really long time to bake. That's an hour and 20 to an hour and 40. I mean, people don't realize that.
No, and it can be really daunting because that is a huge chunk of time. But you want it to be cooked. You work so hard on it. You want it to be cooked. You want it to taste delicious. And I bake everything from frozen because once I make my pies, I keep them in the freezer. And when I have the opportunity to bake, I bake them straight from the freezer. And that just adds more time. But I think it's worth it.
I think I know, but why are we dropping the temperature from 425 to 350 after 25 minutes? Why do you do the temperature drop?
Yeah, I like to blast it at high heat initially just to preserve that pristine design. And then I drop the heat much lower so that we give our filling time to cook all the way through without burning our crust.
Yep. If you're baking from frozen, you might be adding as much as 30 to 45 minutes to that bake time, just so people know.
And numerical ranges are always kind of a suggestion. Really rely on visual cues. If it's been, 50 minutes and your filling is still soupy, then you probably want to keep baking it.
Do you ever use a probe thermometer to pull a pie?
I don't. Probably should for, if there's a pie top that's pretty covered.
Right.
I basically just bake mine until they're bubbling through. For me, I think there's the aesthetic preservation that people are concerned about. They don't want the fruit juices or the filling to bubble through and kind of mar the top design. I feel like that's part of the process. I call it blurpage. It makes the crust extra delicious. So it's not really something that I work really hard to avoid or prevent. So I just rely on that visual.
Now we're going to cool completely on a rack before slicing and serving. And, cooling completely can be 4 hours. People don't. I mean, you can eat a warm pie, but it also, don't you think? Pie can take a really long time to set up.
It takes so long. But a lot of it is passive time. So you're not hunched over your work surface for a full day. No. But there is a lot of waiting or a lot of time involved.
Do you ever slide a warm-ish pie, not hot, into the freezer or refrigerator to cool it down more quickly?
Sometimes I do, especially with tarts.
Yeah, me too.
I feel maybe I shouldn't, but I do it anyways because I'm
Please
impatient.
Don't tell. I won't tell if you don't tell, but I do the same thing.
We won't tell anybody.
Yeah, I'm too
Except
impatient.
everyone who's listening.
Exactly. I wanted to talk about a couple of other recipes from the book that just jumped out at me. The first is Truth or Square. It's an ice cream tart with a funfetti Oreo crust, mint chip ice cream, and Andes mint tiles, which basically is everything I love in the world. I think you describe it as one of the easiest, and either it's my word or your word, but yummiest. Please tell me everything about this.
Yeah, that's my favorite recipe to direct people to if they're like, oh, I am not a baker, I'm not an expert, like I'm really scared to try these things. This one is so easy. The crust is 3 ingredients, comes together in 10 minutes, and that's all the baking you do, and then you fill it with your favorite ice cream. And then you can focus on the design part, which is basically cutting Andes mints in half and then creating a checkerboard design. So again, things can be as complicated as you would like to make them, or you can keep it as simple and streamlined as matches your, time, patience, or skill set. And it tastes delicious. Who doesn't love ice cream with Oreos and sprinkles, and chocolate and mint as a combination is a classic.
I mean, if they don't like that, then I don't like them. I mean, that to me is like heaven. And Andes mints, like so my grandmother. I'm like so all over that.
Very vintage.
Yes, love it. And then one other one I wanted you to tell us a little bit about. And again, these names, Truth or Square. This one's called Buried Treasure, but buried is Berried. Can you tell us about the lavender blueberry whipped cream and the berries and the shortbread in this tart?
Yeah, that one was inspired by kind of summer farmer's market. I'm lucky to have a really lovely one in my neighborhood that runs all year around, but you just cannot beat the produce abundance in the summer season. And there are multiple stands that sell all varieties of berries in all different shades. And I felt like really needed to take advantage of using those colors, those flavors, that gradient in a way that was fresh and also really easy. So you can just plop these berries into this cream that's been infused with lavender or any other kind of flavoring that you want, while maximizing the blackberries as well that are in peak season. So super easy crust that's basically a giant shortbread cookie, a no-cook cream that you whip up that's light and fluffy, and then you put your berries on top. So you can either go with one type of berries or use multiple or arrange them in rows so you have that really fun ombre gradient, or, however you want to construct that design. And then you have a really light, semi-sweet-ish, also tart and juicy dessert to serve right away.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Lauren. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
Oh, right back at you. Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for today's show. Thank you to Plugra Premium European Style Butter and California Prunes for their support. Don't forget to subscribe to She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your baking buddies about us. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network and is recorded at CityVox Studio in Manhattan. Our producers are Kerry Diamond and Catherine Baker. Our associate producer is Jenna Sadhu, and our editorial assistant is Londyn Crenshaw. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking.